You got this, man.
So I've only got one other person with me here.
I'll back you up.
Okay, I know. Oh, there's Craig. All right, cool.
We are live.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is our first Capital Budget Committee. I am really happy to serve with the new Capital Budget Chair. From the House side, Ben Barnes. Mark Chang didn't last very long. It's a tough committee, but we made it through 1 year together. But congratulations to you, Mark, on Vice Chair Appropriations. Chairman Barnes and I have decided to switch off every meeting. So I'll do this meeting. He'll do the next meeting. He'll call on House members. I'll call on Senate members. And if our chairpersons come into the meeting, we'll announce them at that time. So let me just recognize the people who are on the Senate side. First, we have Vice Chair Zucker. Next, we have Senator Eckert. I know she's got a bill in JPR because I just left from there. We've got Senator Edwards. We've got Senator Griffith. We've got Senator King, who's with us. Senator McCray. And Chairman, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your capital budget.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have members of the Capital Subcommittee on the House side, Pat Young, Crow Resnick, Susie Proctor, Mark Corman, Keith Haynes, Jeff Greist, Wendell Beitzel, and of course we have our vice chair, who the only reason he didn't last long is because he's been promoted to vice chair of the entire committee. So, but I'm happy that he stayed on as vice chair of Capital so that we have that institutional knowledge, and I know that we'll continue to work as a team. So congratulations, Mark, and the whole Capital Subcommittee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's it. That's the only time we're going to introduce everybody. So that was your moment of fame right there. So we're going to start off with capital fiscal briefing. Matthew, not Matt, Matthew Klein.
Thank you, members of the capital budget subcommittees for both the House and the Senate. I'm going to start off by giving you kind of a high level review of the governor's proposed capital budget. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, good. So I'm going to work from the charts and just try to give you a kind of a summary of comparison of the fiscal 2022 budget as compared to what was programmed in last year's CIP. And along the lines, we're going to pull out some of the observations and some thoughts that we have about what the legislature may wish to do in their review of the capital budget during session. The first chart in this is just a high level comparison of the fiscal 2022 budget compared to what was programmed in last year's CIP. And a couple observations here. First, GO bond funds are reduced relative to what was programmed in last year's CIP. The governor's fiscal 22 authorization level meets the Spending Affordability Committee's recommendation at annual 1% increases. But relative to last year, the plan last year was increased. The governor came in with a higher level of new bond authorizations beginning in fiscal 2022. So relative to what was programmed last year, it's $50 million less than what was programmed. And that has real consequences because that requires a restructuring of not only fiscal 2022 by approximately 50 million, but 50 million in each of the out years. So you will be presented during your analyses that the analysts are going to give with a number of items where projects have been deferred. And some of that is because not of just project schedules themselves, but to be able to fit the capital program within the Spending Affordability Committee limit. The next piece of this is bond premiums. You can see that the governor's budget includes a substantial use of bond premiums, 210 million in fiscal 2022. There's an additional 34 million of fiscal 21 deficiencies. And this is to utilize the bond premiums from the state's GO bond sales. Based on a change in the advice of bond counsel, the state is limited in how much bond premiums it can use to support debt service. So at this point, unless there's a total restructuring of how the state issues bonds to resize the bonds, the state is likely estimated anyway, to continue to receive significant amounts of bond premiums from our bond sales. And so the governor is now programming that and authorizing the use of those bond premiums in the capital budget bill in fiscal 2022, and has programmed that throughout the 5-year CIP. General funds continue to be a tough haul here. It's been difficult being able to support the capital program with general funds for a variety of reasons. I've got a chart on that later. Special funds go down relative to last year, and this is ostensibly because the governor's budget plan includes the diversion of roughly 100 million of transfer tax, fiscal 22 transfer tax revenues to help support the general fund, and then the backfilling of that with GO bond funds, which I'll get into a little bit later. And then you see here revenue bonds. This is ostensibly the built to learn bonds that the Stadium Authority would issue based on revenues in the Education Trust Fund. And you can see there's no change relative to last year, because last year it was anticipated that the legislation would authorize the issuance beginning in fiscal 2021. As you know, while the legislation was enacted, it was made contingent upon the blueprint, and that was vetoed, and I believe that veto has been overridden. So there's no change relative to last year's plan with respect to the use of revenue bonds, but it is an increase if you were to compare the fiscal 21 appropriation. The next chart just breaks this down, again comparing fiscal 22 to what was planned in last year's CIP, and this breaks this down into its uses. And you can see that education, environment, and higher education continue to be the biggest funding categories. Education was third on the list, but this is supported again by the significant amount of revenue bonds that would be issued through the Built to Learn Act. And so that moves education now to the top of all the funding categories. And there are some adjustments to what was planned last year, and the analyst will be bringing you some of those. State facilities goes down a little bit. There's a deferral of the Shillman Building, District Court in Baltimore, and the Maryland Emergency Management Headquarters facility has also been deferred. That was expected to be funded in fiscal 2022. Health and social goes down a little bit. This is ostensibly a restructuring of the grants that were programmed for the University of Maryland Medical System, for the Cancer and Organ Transplant Center, and for the Shock Trauma Center, and essentially just to align the state's contribution with both the project schedule and the funding that UMS has been able to provide up to this point. There is a reduction in what was programmed for public safety. A number of projects have been deferred based on project schedule, including the beginning of the design for the Therapeutic Treatment Center, which would replace the Men's and Women's Detention Center in Baltimore City, as that's been shifted out a year. In housing, you can see this is one of the places where there's an increase. The governor's proposed fiscal 22 budget includes an enhancement to a number of the grant and loan programs administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development to sort of bolster the resources that the state's providing in things like broadband, rental housing, home ownership, which provides a big piece of that, provides down payment and settlement expenses. So that reflects, the governor's initiative to enhance funding in fiscal 22 for housing programs. Local projects goes up. This is ostensibly because the CIP rarely programs long-term commitments to local projects, but the governor's budget is introduced does include about $33 million of local projects. And then you can see last year transportation, this goes up considerably. And this is really two things. One, the planned use of GO bond funds for the Howard Street Tunnel. That's $21.5 million for fiscal 2022. But it includes the use of bond premiums beginning in fiscal 2022 to support the WMATA grants. The next two charts just compare the uses, the fund sources, and then the uses. But this just compares the 4 years in which the two CIPs overlap, again, to try to pull out a couple significant points. As I had mentioned earlier, the GO bond limit is less than what was programmed. So that's roughly $200 million over the next 4 years relative to last year's plan. And you can see down here the use of bond premiums. It's now $330 million over the next 2 years, because the governor's plan also includes and programs the use of bond premiums for fiscal 2023 to support the WMATA grants. I'm going to skip over this exhibit. It pretty much just is another breakdown by uses, and the same observations I made on exhibit 2 really apply here as well. I wanted to use this chart, though, to point out something that may be missing in all of the bar graphs, which deals with the amount of funding that's being proposed for education. While education funding over the next 4 years is pretty close to being the highest, higher education is first. It's a reduction from what was planned in last year's CIP, because while the revenue bonds, the 2.2 billion of revenue bonds will help support a significant amount of infrastructure development in schools throughout the state, the governor's plan includes a rather sizable reduction in the commitment of GO bond funds to the regular school construction program. Programmed at $280 million in last year's CIP on an annual basis, it's funded at $250 million in fiscal 2022 and roughly $196 million in each of the fiscal 2023 through 2026 is programmed in the plan. So there is a reduction in what the state would be providing to school construction from the GO bond side, while we're increasing it through the use of the revenue bonds. The next exhibit is comparing the use of general fund pay-go and also bond premiums. Essentially, what we're trying to point out here is that the legislature's made some attempts to try to increase the capital program through the use of general funds, which have been relatively limited, particularly since the onset of the Great Recession, and that hasn't really changed much. And going back to 2026, you can see roughly 30 million. The red at the top is the amount that was not released. It was withheld, fenced off funding that was never released. And that's the same thing in 2027. The legislature had intended for a much larger use of general funds by fencing off other portions of general funds that the governor ultimately decided not to release. And the total funding was reduced because of those withheld funds. You can see the same thing in 2020, where the legislature fenced off a significant amount of money, much of that in the dedicated purpose account, to do other things, other capital projects, and instead those funds were never released. And also in here at the top of both fiscal 2020 and 2021, you can see that general funds were further reduced through cost containment actions, the reductions that were brought to the Board of Public Works in May and July, respectively, for fiscal 2020 and 2021. But the other piece here is you can track the use of the bond premiums dating back to fiscal 2016. And you can see that they've been periodically used, again, as another source of funding for the legislature to enhance the overall capital program. And this was done at the stage where the legislature had control of the budget and authorized the use of some bond premiums to enhance the program. The big paradigm shift, however, is that beginning in fiscal 2022, these funds are now programmed in both the budget that's before you for 2022, but programmed in the CIP by the governor. So it precludes the use of those for other purposes unless additional revenues above what is needed for debt service can be found to bolster the level of bond premiums. So essentially, the governor is utilizing a portion of the fiscal 2021 bond premiums to support deficiency appropriations, and then is programming the use of fiscal 2022 and 2023 bond premiums for capital purposes, much of which are going to support the grants through the mandate for WMATA. And since we're on the subject of transportation and WMATA, the next exhibit reflects the planned expenditures for the Howard Street Tunnel and the contribution that the state would make. Overall, the project schedule the total funding is still estimated at $466 million, and the state's contribution would remain at $202 million. The difference, though, there's two differences between last year's plan and this year's plan. Last year's plan relied on $40 million of general funds and $20 million of Baltimore City highway user revenues. Those are no longer part of the funding plan. Instead, the Department of Transportation would pick up $68 million of the total funding plan. Also, the schedule has been moved out. Last year planned for expenditures to end in fiscal 2024. It has now been stretched out to fiscal 2025. Next piece is the WMATA grants. This just shows the grants that have been authorized since fiscal 2020. You can see in 2020 and 2021, the budget used general funds that were in the dedicated purpose account to meet those grants. I know there's been a lot of talk about MDOT being the one to pick that up, but it is at this point general funds have been used. And you can see the cost containment also impacted both of those, 35 million and 28 million respectively in fiscal 2020 and 2021. As you move to fiscal 2022, here's where you see the use of the bond premiums both in fiscal 2022 and 2025, with some use of special funds from MDOT in 2022 to get to the $167 million that's programmed for this. And then you can see in the out years beyond 2023, no more bond premiums are programmed for this. It can be, it's difficult to estimate bond premiums all the way out to, let's say, fiscal 2024. While we've consistently received bond premiums, that really is subject to the market. So the CIP reverts back to using general funds ostensibly in fiscal 2024. Presumably these would also be in the dedicated purpose account. Next, we shift to program open space. A big feature of the governor's budget for fiscal 2022 includes the diversion of roughly 100 million of transfer tax revenues to the general fund to help support the general fund. And essentially the one-for-one replacement of those diversions using general obligation bond funds, and that one-for-one replacement would take place all in fiscal 2022. And this chart shows both the amount of GO bond funds that are being used. This reflects the amount that's being transferred that they would have otherwise got, and then adds in the additional special funds that are not being transferred to those programs to get you to the total 174 million for the capital programs. But again, a big feature is this diversion and the use of 100 million of bond capacity to backfill. Overall, the Department of Legislative Services is recommending the committees think about restructuring that repayment rather than making the repayment all in 1 year. Maybe make this repayment beginning in fiscal 2023 and 2024. I certainly think that the 34 million that's there in GO bond funds for the stateside program open space is something that could certainly be deferred into later fiscal years. And I'll get to that in a second. The second feature of the governor's budget includes provisions that would delay again the repayment of prior transfer tax revenues to the general fund. A repayment schedule was put into place in legislation in 2016 that would begin making repayments in fiscal 2017. For fiscal 2022, the governor is proposing deferring that and is adding that on to future budgets through provisions in the BRFA. And this exhibit just shows you what each of those programs are losing through the decision to defer the repayment that would have otherwise taken place in fiscal 2022. I said earlier about potentially restructuring the state's commitment to this. This chart reflects kind of one of the reasons why. You can see there's a rather sizable unobligated balance in the stateside program open space that's reflected in blue. There's also a large balance on the local side. However, you got to keep in mind that that's spread out amongst all the local jurisdictions. So I don't know that we're necessarily recommending that the program open space local side fund balance be looked at, but certainly the stateside piece, I think, gives some credence to the idea that the 34 million of GO bond funds that are programmed for the stateside aren't really necessary, and that the department can continue to use available fund balance to meet the needs of any program open state fund expenditures on the state side using fund balance rather than appropriating additional funds to the program, particularly GO bond funds. Now back to the repayment schedule. This chart shows the original repayment schedule that was established in 2017 for the prior diversions. That's in blue, versus what happens to the repayment schedule, the actuals through 2021 in the red, versus from fiscal 2022. Then you see what the restructuring that the governor is proposing for fiscal 2022 would have on the out years. And you can see how they would make that up with higher contributions in 2023 all the way through 2028, and then extending those contributions all the way through 2032. DLS is recommending that the committees consider eliminating this restructuring. At this point, the state has committed only around 24 million of what otherwise would have been about 138 million of contributions, and continues to kick this can down the road, putting additional burden on future state operating budgets and the general fund. So we're recommending consideration to eliminate this repayment plan. This chart just reflects the fact that the estimated transfer tax for each of the programs.
Matthew, if you could wait 1 second. Senator McCray, you got a question?
Yes, sir. I had a question about page 10, and I'm not sure if you're taking them at the end or if you wanted to take them now, Mr. Chair.
Why don't we take them at the end, if that's okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so what this shows is what the transfer tax revenues that are currently estimated would provide to each of these programs. And again, it's just a reminder that there is a dedicated source of revenues that support these programs in the long term, minus any decisions to make diversions in the out years. But there is still a robust revenue stream that is projected to support each of these programs beyond fiscal 2022. The one observation to make here with respect to the transfer tax revenues is that they were written down in December 2020 relative to the 2019 estimate. And you can see for fiscal 2021 that $12.7 million, this is a potential underattainment unless there's a rebound through fiscal 2021. This would be a potential underattainment that would have to be absorbed in fiscal 2023. However, the estimates are that when the recession that's been caused by the COVID pandemic is lifted, that the revenues, the transfer tax revenues, would actually increase to roughly 230 and then upwards, as you can see in the December 2020 estimate. The next item deals with the Department of Legislative Services building. The department has procured the assistance of the Maryland Stadium Authority to replace the Department of Legislative Services building. Right now, I believe the plan would be to begin construction shortly after the end of the 2022 session. However, There are no bond authorizations that are programmed either in the fiscal 22 budget or programmed in the CIP to support what would be roughly $113 million project. We wanted to point that out. I think that there's some consideration that rather than trying to find room for 100 million in the capital plan over the next 3 years, that consideration to be given to authorizing the stadium authority to issue appropriation-backed revenue bonds so that this building isn't delayed while trying to figure out how to fit this $100 million into the plan where it currently is not programmed. And then the next item, and this will be the last item I cover because the remainder of this document is dashboards and appendices. And unless there are questions, I'm not going to cover those pieces. The last piece deals with the University System of Maryland Facility Renewal Program. And it compares what was programmed in the 2019, 2020, and now in the 2021 CIP for a 5-year period of each. And you can see that in 2020, the program, the intent was to enhance the program. It was roughly 150 million in 2019 over a 5-year period, and it was increased to roughly 226 million in the 2020 CIP. The big paradigm shift, however, at the time was that GO bond funds would not be used as a contributing fund source, that instead the University System of Maryland would contribute plant funds to this program, both to enhance it and to avoid the need for GO bond funds to support it. And then you can see in 2021 CIP, again, there's a bit of a paradigm shift. They're planning the use of GO bond funds in the back end of the CIP, and they're still planning plant funds. However, the plant funds have been reduced. And I think the big impact for 2022 is that the budget was originally intended to be plant funds and revenue bonds, roughly 48 million, but is only going to be 25 million of revenue bonds because the contribution from the University System of Maryland for fiscal 2022 is essentially being deferred. And this is in recognition of the financial constraints that system has had to face, with everybody else with the impacts of COVID on their financial outlook. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and take questions.
Thank you, Matthew. Senator McCray, page 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Matt, in reference to page 10, could you, I assume what federal Baltimore City means where it has $1 million for 2023 and 2024 in respects to the Howard Street Tunnel, but could you just tell me what that is? And I'm going to ask my second question very quickly so that way you can answer both. When you talked about the 2025 move out, I know that obviously the project is delayed by a year, but are there other implications, especially fiscal implications from that 2025 move out?
Well, certainly the implications, overall to the economy is that the project's going to be delayed relative to last year's plan. And I know that overall, this is considered a very important economic development project. So, delaying anytime you delay this project, if this project's delayed a year, that's just a year less that this project will be available, and they'll be able to, I guess, double or triple stack, the containers through the tunnel, so that it delays the fiscal, the economic impact that project is intended to bring to the state. As far as the federal funds, I think these are TIFIA funds that the department would be utilizing through the federal budget.
But it's not coming from somewhere else and being redirected. This is specifically for that.
No, I don't believe so. I'd admit that I'm not probably the best expert on this, and there'll be analyses that are presented to the committees that drill more into the details. And I think
Sir,
I'll relay this question to our transportation analyst and have them get back to you to give you a little bit more details about the fiscal impact and as well as the use of the federal funds.
I'll tie in with Steve. Thanks, Matt. The last question, and if I'm okay, Mr. Chair. 38, it says BCCC Deferred Maintenance Program. Can you speak to that? This is my first time seeing that.
Right. So BCCC engaged a private entity to review their campus infrastructure needs over the last, I think, 18 months. And a report came out, I believe, roughly summer of last year that indicated, a significant need for infrastructure facility renewal projects at the campus. That's not unlike every other campus and not unlike the constraints that the state faces with keeping up with facility renewal and keeping our facilities at top notch. Last year's CIP programmed the beginning of a dedicated facility renewal program for BCCC to begin in fiscal 2022. Based on this report, it begins to start to fund that at $1.25 million for each of the next 3 years, and then ramps that up to $4 million a year. I think there's general consensus that it's going to take about $4 million a year to keep that under control, to keep the deficit in facility renewal under control. But there's some constraints in being able to fund that all at once as the department is kind of ramping up these activities. So it starts at $1.25 million. I believe BCCC can also access the facility renewal program through the community college facility renewal grant program as well to help bolster some of that. They were supposed to get some in fiscal 2021, but cost containment cut all of that. I'm not sure yet whether or not the deficiency that's in the MHEC program will also result in BCCC receiving the $500,000 that was originally programmed in fiscal 2021 for that. That's something we're still investigating as we will bring the BCCC analysis to you later in session.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. I don't see any other hands. Chairman Barnes, you see any hands?
I don't see any House members. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew.
Sure.
Next, we'll hear from Terry Garrity from the Office of Capital Budget.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Do we have Terry up?
Mr. Chairman, she may not have registered to testify generally during fiscal briefings. There isn't testimony by the agency. So I believe that she may have been on the list, but I don't believe that she is here to actually provide comments.
Okay.
She's listening somewhere.
We were ready for her, so. All right, thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it. Okay, next we'll hear from the Capitol Military Department. Nicholas Konzelman, if you can give us a briefing, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just bring up my screen here. Okay, so we'll be talking about the capital budgets for the military department in fiscal 2022. We're going to jump right into it with the, there's one project included in the 2022 capital budget. It's the Havre de Grace Surface Equipment Automotive Maintenance Center. It is a 49.6 thousand net square foot facility that's going to replace functionally inadequate structures that currently do not conform to National Guard standards. The current facilities are actually repurposed horse racing facilities. And so there's not enough room to adequately accommodate the automotive and surface maintenance bays that are currently required for the military department. The new facility will include maintenance bays that do conform to these standards. It also include administrative offices and space for meetings and personnel instruction. And the fiscal 2022 budget includes $5 million in GO bonds to complete the construction phase of this project. The construction will begin this March and will conclude in September of 2022 for a total duration of 18 months. There are two issues that we're going to talk about very briefly. The first is a proposed real estate agreement with the United States Marine Corps. This has been an ongoing discussion. The military department has been negotiating with the USMC to acquire space in Baltimore City And in exchange, the federal government would acquire 10 acres on the Camp Frederick Military Reservation in a 25-year lease. It's currently a parcel of land that's unsituated and so would currently be developed. And the construction planning is going through the federal review currently as we speak. In addition to that, the military department would receive a facility on Hamlet Avenue in Baltimore City. It's been recently renovated, and so there are currently no planned renovations to meet the military department's needs, but any future renovations would be funded on a 75%, 25% fund split with federal and state funds. And so we are asking the military department to comment on the status of this agreement, the clearinghouse review for this parcel of land on the Camp Frederick Reservation, and any potential need for tenant fit out at the Hamlet Avenue facility. The second point to talk about is the planned divestiture of the Pikesville Armory. This is a historical structure in Baltimore County it's currently a 14-acre parcel with the former Pikesville Readiness Center and 6 other structures. It had been originally offered to Baltimore County for purchase as they have the right of first refusal. However, the county's indicated that they're not interested in the facility. And so DGS is soliciting private bids to sell the property at a fee simple sale. And this is contingent on a historical preservation easement as determined by the Maryland Historical Trust. There is a capital grant for this property and for this project, and we'll be discussing that further when we present the miscellaneous grants included in the 2021 CIP. And we do have language here asking for the military department's comment on the current status of this divestiture. Like Matthew described before, there is one planned deferral in the CIP this year for the military department. This is the MEMA headquarters. It delays funding associated with the design phase of this project. It would be to renovate and expand the current MEMA headquarters, also located on the Camp Frederick property up in Baltimore County. And so they are delaying it 1 year, and there's an additional $385,000 included in 2023 to complete the design phase, as well as $17.1 million in construction and equipping funds for fiscal 2023 and 2024. And finally, we have our recommended actions. We are recommending the approval of the authorization of $5 million in GEO bond funds to complete the construction phase of the Havre de Grace facility. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, are there any questions for Nicholas?
Delegate Haynes had his hand raised for a moment. Your question been answered, Delegate? Actually, back up. Delegate Haynes?
I actually can wait until the department comes up. It's fine.
All right, thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
All right, next we'll hear from Major General Timothy Gowan from the department.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm just unmuted. All right, good afternoon, Chairman Peters, Chairman Barnes, Vice Chair Zucker, and Vice Chair Chang. I'm also joined by the Executive Director of Maryland Emergency Management Agency, Russ Strickland. At least I'm assuming he's out there virtually. Once again, good afternoon. The Maryland Military Department appreciates the opportunity to update this committee on the capital activities of the department and to respond to the recommendations and requested updates contained in the capital budget analysis prepared by Mr. Nicholas Conzelman of the Department of Legislative Services. I would like to thank Mr. Conzelman for the well-prepared analysis of the department's capital budget. Just an overview of the recent departmental capital accomplishments. Capital improvement projects and related capital funding, as always, is necessary for the department to continue and improve our percentage of facilities to a fully functional status, which is currently at 28%. We're currently in the process of divesting 6 of our older readiness centers. That's Greenbelt, Cascade, Pikesville, Catonsville, Ellicott City, and Queen Anne. We have new construction or renovation completed for 3 readiness centers in Eastern, Freedom, and Havre de Grace. And our current capital improvement program includes funding for a new armory at White Oak, Havre de Grace, as Mr. Councilman mentioned, the Havre de Grace Combined Support Maintenance Shop, which is in design, and as you also mentioned, the MEMA headquarters expansion. Wanted to touch on the Marine Corps Reserve deal that Mr. Councilman referred to. The United States Marine Corps Reserve will license a 10-acre parcel at Camp Frederick Military Reservation for them to build a new, larger reserve center than the one that they currently occupy on Hamlet Avenue in Baltimore. The lease period is 50 years with a renewal option of 10 for the $40 million military construction project, which was approved by the Board of Public Works and is managed by the Department of General Services. The licensed property is partially forested and currently unused. A reforestation plan has been developed to adhere to the Maryland Department of Natural Resources guidelines. The project is currently in the design phase and construction is anticipated to begin in September of this year. The commanding officer of Naval Facilities, also known as NAVFAC, and the commanding officer of United States Marine Corps Reserves have both received notification of our desire to acquire a lease on the Hamlet Avenue federal property once the Marine Corps Reserves moves into the newly constructed facility at Camp Frederick. And the Marine Corps Engineering Battalion currently occupying the Hamlet Avenue facility requires more space to effectively house and store unit personnel and equipment. So NAVFAC said that they must follow the specific clearinghouse guidelines similar to those for the state of Maryland, and they're unable to designate that property specifically for us. However, they do not forecast or anticipate any other Department of the Navy or Marine Corps interest in that location. So because such action would have already been initiated. So based upon the present system's life cycle management and renovations to the Hamlet Avenue facility in 2010, no life cycle system replacements are anticipated until at least 2030. And at that time, it's estimated that boiler burners will need to be replaced at a cost of approximately $20,000. Major systems and/or roofing replacements are not expected until at least 2035 out to 2040. You also asked us to comment on the divestiture of the Pikesville Armory. The Pikesville Armory was vacated in May of 2016, and the property is currently pending advertisement and subsequent actions under the direction of the Department of General Services. Disposal of that property is expected in December of 2021. And then also on the GEO bond recommended actions, they approved the authorization of about roughly $5 million in general obligations funds for the Havre de Grace Combined Support Maintenance Shop Surface Equipment and Automotive Maintenance Facility. This will fund the final phase of the facility's construction, and we concur with DLS GEO bond recommendation. This concludes my remarks.
Hey, do we have any questions for the general?
We did still have Delegate Haynes, Mr. Chairman, hanging out there. Delegate Haynes?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Actually, my question was answered in the military department's testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, General. All right, next we'll hear from Capital Department Planning. Andrew, you're up.
Thank you, sir. And I'll be moving to Capital Department of Planning here. First page you see there, the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory Expansion and Renovation Project is the one state-owned capital improvement in the capital improvement program, state-owned project. It's $2.7 million or so. And then for the grant and loan capital improvement program, there's $9 million for Historic Revitalization Tax Credit Program, $200,000 for Historical Trust Revolving Loan Fund, $1 million for the African American Heritage Preservation Grant Program, and finally $600,000 for the Maryland Historical Trust Capital Grant Fund. Now, getting into some of the cost containment actions that occurred recently in 2020, the May 2020 and July 2020 cost containment actions through the Board of Public Works reduced the funding for the Historic Revitalization Tax Credit Program by the tune of $7 million for the May action, and then around $5.5 million for the July action. So those are cost containment actions done in order to address the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for fiscal flexibility. However, that funding does challenge the program because the money goes into the tax credit reserve fund. And then over the years, as those tax credits are claimed, the money is then sent to the state's general fund. If the money is not there, obviously to send to the general fund, then there's a problem. In terms of what's happened, in order to address that, in order to keep going with those projects, the agency has brought in special fund amendments from the fund, basically, in a sense, borrowing from prior year authorizations in a sense, but that can't last. That's something that eventually there will need to be some kind of accounting in some way. Either there have to be additional general funds provided to the program or some other action will need to be taken. The agency does note that it's around $7.4 million of disbursements per year and that it can handle it for a little while. But I will note also that in fiscal 22, there's another $2 million reduction in the general funds provided for that program. DLS recommends that the Maryland Department of Planning comment on how it plans to manage the tax credit program going forward, given the unfunded liabilities created by the cost containment actions. In terms of the overall capital budget, we just talked really briefly about the overall program funding. The Maryland Historical Tax Revitalization Tax Credit Program has $9 million, but it's only $7 million in general funds, which is more than what's provided in 21, but still it doesn't reflect the full $9 million that have been provided in previous years. It means that that's kind of building that hole or digging that hole a little deeper for the program. Just also like to note here that the program has had some staffing challenges and had some vacancies, which is a challenge its ability to kind of meet the deadlines it would like to meet in terms of awarding those tax credits and reviewing them. For the Historical Trust Revolving Loan Fund, there's $300,000, no change between the 2 years. Just note here briefly that the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum has received a grant effectively from the loan fund for fiscal 21. And that would mean that over the years, that money will not revolve back to the fund, and therefore it will need capitalization further than it, or earlier than it would have otherwise needed it. The African American Heritage Preservation Program, you see it's $1 million in general obligation bonds for 2 years, and then similarly, the flat funding for the Historical Trust Grant Fund as well. In terms of the African American Heritage Preservation Grant Program, the encumbrances look good. They've been encumbering the money well, but the expenditures are lagging. And that reflects the fact that projects usually done by smaller nonprofit organizations that don't have as much of the capacity perhaps as a larger organization to get that money out the door. So the program is working with them to try to resolve those unexpended amounts from prior years. And then for the Capital Grant Fund, you'll see the funding has been encumbered well, and it's being expended fairly well, except for in recent years when they kind of provided more recent funding. And the agency is also working on that. In terms of the state-owned projects in the capital budget, there's the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory Expansion Renovation Project. The overall project increases in funding by $1.3 million in total need between the 2020 CIP and the 2021 CIP, and that's mostly for construction funding. It's additional funding due to delays in the project, which causes escalation in costs, as well as new components as well. There's money for HVAC upgrade, for underground storage tank removal, and also fire suppression equipment as well. And so that will kind of lead into one of our recommendations. Actually, going back here, the department has noted that its project schedule is a little delayed. They've been pushed back a little bit. Therefore, DLS recommends that $2 million in GO bond authorization for the construction portion of the lab be reduced and that be pre-authorized for fiscal 23. And that would leave $500,000 to fund construction in fiscal 22 and allow the project to kind of go to solicitation. So in terms of that action, there already is a pre-authorization for fiscal 23. DLS recommends adding to that. So that would make it around a $9.9 million or almost $10 million pre-authorization for fiscal 23 if DLS's recommendation to move that funding out is adopted. The PAYGO recommended actions to concur with the governor's allowance for all the programs. And then once again, this reflects a $2 million reduction for MAC Lab funding in 22, excuse me, and then the pushing out of that money to pre-authorize the funding in fiscal 23. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. Any questions for Andrew? I don't see any.
Go in there.
Senator Zucker.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick, So for the African American Heritage Grants, for those funds that aren't being expended, these organizations aren't losing the money, right? Are they? It's not reverting. It's just you're working with them to expend it.
Well, I'm not doing anything.
I know.
Yes,
I know.
But yeah, the agency is working with them. The money is not being taken away.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, not seeing any questions. Thank you, Andrew. Is Secretary McCord here with us?
Yes, Secretary McCord is here. Thank you.
Okay, it's all yours.
So,
Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, chairs and vice chairs. Joining me today is Elizabeth Hughes, the Executive Director of the Maryland Historical Trust. I have Ann Raines, the Deputy Director of the Trust, and Greg Pierce, the Executive Director down at the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, where the Maryland Archaeological Conservatory Lab is located. 1 second, please. Trying to make sure I got a clear voice for you. So I'd like to thank Andrew Gray for his analysis and his interest in our agency. We are an agency that does a lot of different things over the course of the state, and Andrew keeps tabs on everything very well. Appreciate his analysis. The first comment that we're asked to make is about the timing of the projects in the tax credit program, and we realize that that is not a sustainable long-term strategy, and we are looking carefully to figure out what to do to get the money put back in that program. We're continuing to track the completion of the projects, and we're working with DBM to advise them of when we can come up with a schedule to put the money back into that program. But the first item actually is the Mac Lab itself. That renovation project, that construction on that project has been delayed, and that reduces the need for funds in fiscal year 22. So we concur with that. The other actions that, as you can see from our written testimony, we've concurred with, but we understand that the process of when tax credits are claimed and when that money is needed isn't an infinite gap. The gap gets smaller and smaller. As a COVID response measure, that is one thing, and we don't look at this as a long-term strategy for trying to manage the tax credit program. And just wanted to make sure that you understood that we understand that we are looking to how we can fix that situation. We're looking at all of our options at this point. And if you have any questions for myself or the executive director at the trust or at the Mac Lab, we can help answer those questions.
Okay, are there any questions?
I have, Mr. Chairman, I have Delegate Corman on our side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, this is a little bit of a homework assignment, if you don't mind, but there's a bill, HB 1099, that's going to be before appropriations next week regarding African-American cemetery preservation. And it seems to have a lot of overlap with the existing historic grant program for African-American preservation. So I'm hoping you might be able to take a look at HB 1099 in advance of that hearing. I expect you're not going to submit testimony on that hearing, but I hope we can discuss whether or not there's some ability to meet the goals of the sponsor of that legislation, which I think is a goal many of us share, to make sure we're taking care of our historic African-American cemeteries. I see on the website for the grant program that cemeteries are eligible, but they seem to have a high bar to get funding. So I'm not going to put you on the spot now, but if you wouldn't mind taking a look at HB 1099 and connecting with me, I would appreciate it.
Duly noted, sir. No problem.
Great. My aide will follow up with your office. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary.
All right, thank you.
All right, next we'll hear from Information Technology. Mr. Patrick Frank.
All right, I'm trying to share my screen. Do you see the screen? Okay. All right. Do you all see my screen?
Kind of hard to hear you, Patrick. Can you turn up your volume a little
I
bit?
can see it, but we can't hear
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Is this helpful on the volume? Okay, well then I'll be sure to speak loudly and move through this quickly. The first table shows the spending. As you can see, for the information technology, there's only one project. It's the Public Safety Communication System. It's also called Maryland First. It's a 700 megahertz first responder radio system. You've already provided $360 million for this project. So it's been around for a few decades, and there's quite a bit of talk. So I'll move through quickly. The first item I have is this map, and it shows where we are with respect to building the system. And I guess you could say that we're at the end of the beginning. That dark green part are the last 5 counties that are going to be implemented and go live this calendar year. Prince George's, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's counties are expected to be live by July of this year, and then Montgomery County by September. So the system itself is almost done. But there still is some work to do. There's 2 kinds of things that are going on here that will need to be done. First, they have found some gaps in the system where there's very low call ratios, where there's a lot of it's difficult getting through. And so what the department has done is identify a number of sites in the out years where they can make the most improvements to this system. The earlier ones tend to be the less expensive ones. So the idea is to do as much as fast and as cheaply as we can, and then the later ones tend to be a little bit more expensive. Another issue is the technology is changing from T1 to Ethernet. The main difference is that this will allow for more capacity on the system. Also, Motorola, who will not be supporting Ethernet beginning in 2022. So this is another part of what the funding is for. As you can see here are the costs. There's 5.3 million anticipated in this year. It's about half and half between the Ethernet and some of the towers and backhaul. The Ethernet will be finished in 2023, and then you can see the out-year schedule for and costs for the towers themselves. This is the same CIP that was last year, so there's really no changes to the plan. I'm just updating you on what we heard last year. I do want to point out that there is a pre-authorization. This is the same number that was pre-authorized last year, is recommended again. And finally, our recommendations are to approve the $5.3 million for the towers and the Ethernet, and also to approve the pre-authorization. And that concludes my remarks. I'll answer questions.
Okay, Mr. Chair. I think
Yep, we do have a question on the House side. Delegate Susie Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you, Mr. Frank, explain Motorola's position, what it was, and what its status is now?
Motorola is the vendor that is building the system right now. So they are working on getting the technology in there, the design, the backhaul, the towers, and all that kind of thing. And so they're the main vendor for this project, if you will.
And we expect them to continue with Maryland First?
Yeah, there is. Okay, now that the system's going to be built, it's going to change, and there's not going to be this kind of construction as there has been in the recent years. Now, one of the things that'll be happening is we're going to move to a maintenance schedule, and the maintenance is going to be divided into 2 parts. There's some proprietary information that's in the system that Motorola has, in which we will have to use their system, and they will be doing that maintenance. However, there are some other things, radios and things like that, in which we're hoping to get a bid where a number of different vendors can bid on these other maintenance contracts. And the idea is to get some competition for that. But a good part of the proprietary information, by definition, we're not going to be able to move to a different vendor, but we will have some competition on some of the maintenance.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Delegate.
Okay, any other questions for Patrick? Oh, Senator Eckert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Along those same lines, Patrick, have those bids gone out, and does DoIT do their own procurement, or do they work with DBM? With procurement system?
Yeah, that's okay. The couple of questions there. First of all, I cannot remember what the schedule is, but I know we're getting close to the end. And in the next year or two, there should be these procurements should be out. Yeah, DoIT probably is going to be very much involved in these procurements, but I believe the Department of General Services now is the state's main procurement agency. So
Right.
DoIT would be working with DGS, but because of DoIT's expertise, I cannot imagine that they would not be heavily involved in the procurements.
So for folks who might be interested in that kind of activity, we should direct them to do it? Or I can ask the department.
Either, yeah, I would imagine DoIT it doesn't hurt to direct them both, DoIT and DGS, but yeah.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions for Patrick? Thank you very much, Patrick. Next, we'll be joined by Secretary Leahy.
Good afternoon, Chairman Peters. This is Norm Farley. I'm standing in for Secretary Leahy. Good afternoon, Chairman Peters and Chairman Barnes and members of the committee. I'm Norm Farley, the Chief of Public Safety Communications from the Maryland Department of IT. Secretary Mike Leahy sends his regrets, but due to last minute issues, unable to attend this afternoon. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to provide this testimony to the committee. The Secretary's testimony has been filed with the committee, so I won't read it here. I would like to thank Patrick Frank, our DLS analyst, for all his hard work. In summary, the Department of IT does have only one capital project. It is Maryland First, the Public Safety Communication Systems, in which we're requesting a total of $5.3 million for FY22. In addition, we are requesting advance approval of $2,650,000 in general obligation funds for FY23 to complete the T1 to Ethernet conversion project that Patrick mentioned. We thank the committee for its consideration and ask that our FY22 capital budget request be approved. And I stand ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for the Secretary? All right. Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I believe that concludes our capital budget hearing. Chairman Barnes, you have anything else to add?
Nope. Thank you. Thank the committee for a great first meeting. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.